October 4th, 1990, Lower Manhattan. Beneath the World Trade Center, a black Cadillac sits parked on level B1. Fluorescent light hums against concrete. The garage is quiet. No cameras watch this corner. No guard walks this row. Inside the car, a man is slumped behind the wheel. 2 bullet wounds. 1 shot to the head. Blood pooled on the seat, then dried. His name is Louis de Bono, Gambino family soldier. A man who built fortunes laying fireproofing foam on the steel bones of these very towers. Nobody notices the car for 3 days. Commuters park beside it. Businessmen walk past it on their way to elevators. Not one person looks twice at the man who isn't moving. When police finally open the door, the smell tells them before the wound does. Here is the twist the world didn't expect. De Bono wasn't killed by a rival family. He wasn't killed for stealing, for informing, or for disrespecting a rule of the underworld written in blood generations ago. He was killed for missing meetings. He was killed because he stopped showing up when the boss called his name, and the boss was John Gotti, a man who had rebuilt the entire Gambino family on a single brutal principle: obey me or die. This is the story of a man who tried to outrun the most famous mobster in American history and lost in a garage beneath 2 towers that would not stand for much longer themselves. Louis de Bono did not look like a man destined for a bullet in a parking garage. He looked like a contractor, because that is exactly what he was. Behind the label of Gambino soldier, de Bono ran a legitimate-looking construction and demolition business in New York, the kind of company that wins government contracts, signs union agreements, and sends invoices on letterhead. That surface was the entire point. In the world de Bono operated in, the Mafia did not always announce itself with Tommy guns and back-alley meetings. By the late 20th century, it announced itself with concrete, drywall, and steel. De Bono's specialty was fireproofing. Spray-applied insulation, packed into the steel crossbeams beneath the floors of high-rise towers, designed to keep a building's skeleton from buckling in a fire. It was unglamorous work. It was also extraordinarily profitable, because in New York City, no contractor poured concrete, hauled debris, or sprayed fireproofing on a major job site without touching a mob-controlled union first. That was the arrangement de Bono mastered. He didn't need to be an enforcer. He didn't need a reputation for violence. He needed access to contracts, access to no-show jobs, access to the machinery that let organized crime skim a percentage off nearly every major construction project built in Manhattan during the 1970s and 1980s. Among his crowning achievements, de Bono's firm secured the fireproofing contract on one of the largest and most prestigious construction sites in the country, the World Trade Center itself. Millions of dollars flowed through that single deal, and a significant cut of it, as always, flowed upward through the Gambino hierarchy. To the outside world, Louis de Bono was a businessman with an Italian surname and a knack for city contracts. Inside the family, he carried a different kind of reputation, a soldier who kept his head down, made his money quietly, and avoided the front pages. Unlike the men who craved attention, de Bono seemed to prefer invisibility. He was not a killer by trade, not a headline gangster, not the kind of man tabloids wrote about. This distinction mattered more than it might first appear. The American Mafia of the mid-20th century had always contained 2 overlapping castes of men, the earners and the enforcers. Enforcers built reputations through violence, through beatings, shootings, and the fear those acts generated up and down a crew. Earners built reputations through revenue, through their ability to generate a steady, reliable flow of cash that could be kicked upward through the family's hierarchy, without drawing unwanted attention from police or prosecutors. De Bono belonged unmistakably to the second caste, and for most of his career, that classification served him well. Earners were valuable precisely because they did not need to be watched closely. They did not start wars. They did not draw heat. They simply produced. That preference for invisibility would ultimately kill him, because the man who was about to take control of the Gambino family had the opposite instinct entirely. He wanted attention. He wanted deference. And he demanded that every soldier who made money in his name show up, in person, and account for it. Dibano had spent years building an identity as a quiet earner, a man who paid his tribute, avoided drama, and let his construction empire speak for him. In the Castellano era of the Gambino family, that identity was survivable. Paul Castellano, the boss before Gotti, ran the family like a corporation. He cared about money. He rarely demanded blind personal loyalty theater from his soldiers. A man like Dibano, who quietly kicked up his share and stayed out of the papers, could thrive under that kind of leadership. But Castellano would not remain boss for long. And the man who replaced him did not run the family like a business. He ran it like a court, and every soldier was expected to kneel before the throne, not just pay for the privilege of sitting near it. Dibano didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath his quiet, profitable life was about to shift permanently. To fully appreciate what Dibano had built, it helps to understand how mob-connected construction actually functioned in New York during this period. It was not a matter of a few corrupt contractors skimming cash on the side. By the 1970s and 1980s, organized crime had embedded itself so deeply into the concrete and construction trades that federal investigators later described it as a cartel system in which the five families divided territory, fixed bids, and controlled the unions whose members poured every foundation and raised every steel beam in the 5 boroughs. No major building went up without someone somewhere paying tribute to a captain or a soldier who controlled the local. Dibano's genius, if it can be called that, was in choosing the least glamorous corner of that cartel and mastering it completely. Fireproofing contracts rarely made headlines. They were buried in the fine print of massive construction budgets, negotiated between engineers and subcontractors long before a building's steel frame was ever visible to the public. That obscurity gave Dibano room to operate almost like a legitimate businessman, moving between city agencies, insurance inspectors, and union representatives, with the practiced calm of a man who had never fired a gun in his life. It also meant that when investigators eventually went looking for evidence of mob influence on major public projects, Dibano's name surfaced not as a suspect in a shooting or an extortion case, but as a line item, a signature on invoices, a name on payroll records, a shareholder in companies that existed mostly on paper. That was precisely the kind of criminal profile Paul Castellano valued, and precisely the kind that would soon become expendable under different leadership. To understand how a construction contractor became a made man, whose death would later be tied directly to one of the most infamous murders in Mafia history, you have to understand the machine he rose inside the Gambino crime family, the largest and most powerful of New York's 5 families. By the 1970s, the Gambino family functioned less like a street gang and more like a shadow government of the New York construction industry. Concrete companies, carting and waste hauling firms, labor unions controlling who could work and who could not. Dibano moved through this world as an associate, then a made member, embedding his business inside a system where legitimate commerce and criminal tribute were inseparable. His rise wasn't built on violence. It was built on utility. Dibano generated cash, real cash, from real contracts, laundered through real invoices, in an organization where soldiers were valued by how much money they sent up the chain. Dibano's construction rackets made him useful in a way that few enforcers could match. Muscle was replaceable. A man who could win million-dollar city contracts was not. That utility bought Dibano a specific kind of freedom. He answered to capos. He kicked up his percentage. But he largely ran his own operation, cultivated his own relationships with union officials, and stayed several layers removed from the family's more violent business. For a mob soldier, this was close to an ideal existence. money without exposure. The family itself, meanwhile, was entering its most turbulent period in half a century. Paul Castellano, who had led the Gambinos since the mid-1970s, was increasingly viewed by rank-and-file soldiers as detached a boss who lived like an executive in a mansion on Staten Island, more interested in white-collar rackets than the street-level loyalty rituals that held traditional mob culture together. Resentment simmered among capos who felt Castellano had grown too comfortable, too remote, too willing to let ambitious young captains twist in the wind of federal investigations without support. One of those captains was John Gotti, a Queens-born soldier with a taste for tailored suits, tabloid attention, and a crew of loyal, aggressive earners beneath him. Gotti had built his own power center within the family, largely through gambling and hijacking rackets, and had cultivated a reputation as a captain who took care of his own men, even when it meant defying the boss's rules. By the mid-1980s, the tension between Castellano's corporate detachment and Gotti's street-level charisma had become a fault line running straight through the Gambino family. The Bando, absorbed in his construction empire, likely saw himself as a bystander to that power, struggle a soldier whose loyalty was to the family's bottom line, not to any single man's ambitions. That assumption would prove fatal, because the coming shift in leadership would not simply change who collected tribute at the top. It would change the entire code by which loyalty was measured, and Dabano's quiet, semi-independent existence would not survive the transition. It is worth pausing on Castellano himself, because understanding the boss Dabano thrived under is the only way to understand the boss who eventually killed him. Castellano had inherited the Gambino throne in 1976, following the natural death of Carlo Gambino, the family's namesake. He governed less like a traditional street boss and more like the chief executive of a criminal holding company, delegating violent enforcement to capos while he focused on high-value white-collar rackets, construction bid rigging, labor racketeering, and skimming from the garment and meat industries. Castellano rarely visited social clubs. He preferred meetings at his Staten Island mansion, nicknamed the White House by federal agents who watched it around the clock. That leadership style created exactly the kind of environment where a man like Di Bando could flourish. Castellano wanted earners, not enforcers. He wanted men who understood contracts, unions and invoices, men who could make the construction rackets hum quietly in the background, while the family's more violent factions handled the gambling, loan sharking, and hijacking that made up the rest of its portfolio. The Bando fit that mold perfectly, and for over a decade, the arrangement worked exactly as intended. But Castellano's detachment bred resentment among the family's more traditional, street-oriented captain's men, who had come up through hijackings, extortion, and gambling, and who viewed Castellano's polished corporate style as a betrayal of the Mafia's blue-collar roots. Gotti was the loudest and most dangerous of those captains, and by the mid-1980s, the fault line between Castellano's boardroom mafia and Gotti's street mafia had become impossible to ignore. December 16, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse, Manhattan, Paul Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bellotti, stepped out of a car near the restaurant's entrance for what was supposed to be a routine dinner meeting. 4 gunmen in trench coats and fur hats were waiting on the sidewalk. Within seconds, both men were dead, shot down in the open street in front of stunned pedestrians. The hit had been orchestrated by John Gotti and his ally Sammy Gravano, executed without the sanction of the Mafia's ruling commission, an almost unthinkable breach of underworld protocol. Killing a sitting boss without commission approval was traditionally a death sentence for the men who ordered it. Gotti gambled that his growing power and the wave of public admiration the murder generated in the tabloids would let him seize the throne before anyone could challenge him for taking it. The gamble worked. Within weeks, Gotti was the new boss of the Gambino family, and the entire internal culture of the organization shifted beneath the soldiers who had built their lives around Castellano's rules. This was the true turning point, not just for the Gambino family, but for men like Louis de Bono specifically. Castellano had tolerated soldiers who operated with a degree of independence, so long as the money kept moving upward. Gotti demanded something different, visible, personal, face-to-face deference. He wanted his soldiers in the room. He wanted them answering his summons without delay, without excuse, without exception. For a man like de Bono, who had spent over a decade cultivating exactly the kind of quiet, semi-autonomous operation Castellano's leadership style had allowed this new regime was a direct threat to the way he had always done business. De Bono's construction empire required discretion. Union officials, city inspectors, and business partners did not want to see a contractor summoned like an errand boy to sit in a Gambino social club whenever the boss snapped his fingers. Every public appearance at Gotti's side was a risk to the legitimate-facing business de Bono had built his entire fortune on. There was also a second, more human turning point brewing beneath the surface. Sammy Gravano, Gotti's underboss, and one of the family's most feared enforcers, had entered into a business partnership with de Bono, one that had soured over disputed money and mounting distrust. By November of 1989, that partnership was formally dissolved, with taxes settled and the arrangement legally terminated. But dissolving a business partnership with the family's underboss did not mean walking away clean. It meant de Bono now had a former partner, close to the boss, who no longer had any financial incentive to protect him and possibly resented him. De Bono's fatal miscalculation was this. He assumed that if he simply stayed away, avoided the social clubs, skipped the meetings, kept his head down exactly as he always had, the storm around him would eventually pass. He treated Gotti's summons the way he might have treated an unwanted phone call from a difficult client, something to be delayed, deflected, managed from a distance. He did not understand that under the new boss, distance itself was the crime. The Castellano assassination itself deserves closer examination, because the method Gotti chose to seize power reveals everything about the standard he would later apply to men like de Bono. Killing a boss without commission approval was, in the traditional structure of the American Mafia, close to unthinkable, a violation so severe that it typically triggered a war between families rather than a peaceful transfer of power. Gotti bet everything on a single calculation, that once Castellano was dead, and once he personally controlled the guns, the loyalty, and the earning power of the Gambino family's most active crews, no rival boss would risk an all-out war to punish him for a killing already carried out. The bet succeeded, but it left Gotti in a permanently precarious position. He was a boss who had proven, through his own actions, that positions of power in the Gambino family were not sacred. They could be seized by whoever was willing to spill blood and move fast enough. That same lesson, learned once by Gotti at Castellano's expense, could just as easily be learned by an ambitious soldier watching Gotti's own reign for signs of weakness. The only defense against that vulnerability was absolute, unblinking control, a demand for visible submission so constant and so total that no crack could ever widen into a challenge. Louis de Bono, quietly running his construction business and treating the change in leadership as a distant corporate reshuffling rather than a fundamental change in the rules of survival, had no way of knowing he was standing directly inside that fault line. To understand why refusing a meeting could become a capital offense, you have to understand the political theater John Gotti built around his own image both inside the underworld and in the eyes of the public. By 1986, Gotti had become something almost unprecedented in American organized crime, a mafia boss who courted celebrity. Nicknamed the Dapper Don for his $1,000 suits, and later the Teflon Don after prosecutors repeatedly failed to convict him, Gotti cultivated a public persona that blended menace with charisma. Tabloids photographed him outside his Queens social club. Crowds gathered to see him. He was, by the mid-1980s, arguably more famous than most legitimate celebrities in New York. That fame was not incidental to his power, it was central to it. Gotti had seized control of the Gambino family through an unsanctioned assassination, a move that left him without the traditional legitimacy other bosses inherited through commission approval and internal consensus. To compensate, Gotti built a different kind of legitimacy, the legitimacy of fear, spectacle, and absolute personal command. If the old rules of underworld succession wouldn't grant him authority, he would manufacture authority through sheer force of personality and enforce it ruthlessly on anyone who failed to publicly acknowledge it. Gotti's own biography reinforced this appetite for spectacle. Born in the South Bronx and raised in poverty in East New York, Brooklyn, Gotti had clawed his way up through petty theft, hijacking crews, and gambling operations before catching the attention of the Gambino family's leadership in the 1960s and 1970s. Unlike Castellano, who had married into Mafia aristocracy and inherited much of his standing, Gotti built his reputation from the bottom, through visible acts of aggression and an unmistakable talent for commanding loyalty among the men beneath him. That self-made quality became central to his mythology once he reached the top, a boss who had clawed his way to power rather than inherited it, and who intended to defend that power with the same aggression that had won it. This is where the political dimension of Di Bunno's story becomes unavoidable. Gotti's rise took place during one of the most aggressive periods of federal prosecution the American Mafia had ever faced. The FBI's Gambino Squad, empowered by the RICO Act's sweeping conspiracy provisions, was actively building cases against the family's entire leadership structure. Gotti had already beaten multiple prosecutions by 1990, reinforcing his Teflon reputation, but that same reputation made him a top priority target for federal investigators determined to finally bring him down. In that atmosphere, internal discipline became existential for Gotti. Every soldier who operated independently, who avoided face-to-face meetings, who kept his own counsel rather than reporting directly to the boss, represented a potential vulnerability, a man who might cut a deal with prosecutors, a man whose loyalty could not be personally verified, because he was never in the room to demonstrate it. Di Bunno's absence, then, was not merely a personal insult to Gotti's ego. In the paranoid, surveillance-saturated climate of the late 1980s Gambino family, an unreachable soldier was a security risk that Gotti could not tolerate, especially one who had already dissolved a partnership with the family's underboss under contested terms. There is also a simpler, more human political reality beneath the FBI paranoia. Gotti had built his entire claim to power on the idea that no one defied him. He had murdered his own boss to take the throne. If a soldier as visible and profitable as Louis Di Bunno could ignore his summons without consequence, it would broadcast a dangerous message to every other capo and soldier watching that the new boss's authority had limits. Federal investigators, monitoring conversations inside Gambino social clubs during this period, later obtained recordings that captured the machinery of that authority in motion. In one taped conversation from December 1989, Gotti discussed Di Bunno directly with his underboss, naming him and stating flatly that Di Bunno would die specifically because he had refused to come in when summoned, and for no other transgression. That recording would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence used to convict members of Gotti's inner circle. But in December 1989, it was simply a death sentence being spoken aloud in a Brooklyn apartment 10 months before it was carried out. It is worth situating this moment within the broader political war being waged against the American Mafia as an institution. The 1970 Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had by the late 1980s become the single most effective legal weapon ever deployed against organized crime in the United States. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge an entire criminal enterprise as a conspiracy, rather than pursuing individual crimes one at a time, meaning a boss could be convicted for ordering a murder even if he never touched the weapon. so long as prosecutors could establish the pattern of racketeering activity behind it. This legal shift transformed the internal politics of every mafia family in New York. The 1985 commission trial had already convicted the bosses of 3 of the 5 families using RICO, sending an unmistakable signal that the government now had the tools to dismantle mafia leadership structures wholesale rather than picking off soldiers one at a time. Gotti, watching this unfold from within the Gambino ranks, understood that his own survival depended on tightening internal discipline to a degree no previous boss had ever attempted, because in the RICO era, a single loose, unreachable, unaccountable soldier was no longer just an embarrassment. He was a liability capable of sinking the entire organization. Against that backdrop, Dibano's insistence on operating at arm's length from the boss took on a much darker meaning in Gotti's eyes. It was not merely disrespect. It looked, to a paranoid and legally besieged leadership, like the behavior of a man positioning himself to cut a deal if the walls ever closed in. By early 1990, Louis Dibano was, without fully realizing the extent of it, a marked man operating on borrowed time. The machinery around him had already been set in motion. His business partnership with Gravano had been formally severed in November of 1989, a clean legal dissolution on paper, but a clear signal within the family that Dibano's usual protectors had stepped back. Gravano, according to later testimony, had been instructed by Gotti to end the partnership and then stay away from Dibano entirely, leaving Gotti to handle him himself. That phrase, delivered from the top of the organization, meant only one thing to anyone who understood the culture Dibano operated inside. Dibano, for his part, continued behaving as he always had. He kept working his construction contracts. He kept generating money. And, according to accounts that later emerged from within the organization, he kept avoiding the summons to appear before Gotti, whether out of stubbornness, distrust, fear of the consequences of showing up, or simple denial that the situation had become as serious as it was. This is the psychological core of Dibano's final months, a man caught between 2 forms of danger, unable to find a safe path through either. If he appeared before Gotti, he risked confronting a boss already primed to view him as disloyal, a man whose severed partnership with the underboss made him vulnerable to any accusation leveled against him. If he continued avoiding the summons, he confirmed, in Gotti's eyes, exactly the crime already suspected a soldier who believed himself above the family's new order. There is no indication Dibano attempted to flee the city, disappear, or seek protection from law enforcement. Unlike other mob figures of the era who sensed their own execution approaching and turned informant to save themselves, Dibano appears to have simply continued his pattern of quiet avoidance, the same strategy that had protected him for years under Castellano's more permissive leadership, now deployed against a boss who read that exact behavior as an act of open defiance. Other soldiers within the family reportedly viewed the situation with a mixture of confusion and unease. Missing meetings, in the traditional culture of the Mafia, had rarely been treated as a killing offense on its own, particularly not for a made man with no history of informing, stealing from the family, or crossing a rival organization. Some members of the Gambino family were said to be uneasy that a boss would order an execution over something as seemingly minor as repeated absences. It was, by the standards of men who had lived through decades of Mafia discipline, an unusually harsh application of the family's code evidence to some that the new administration operated by a different and more volatile standard than the one before it. But unease among soldiers did not translate into intervention. In an organization built on strict hierarchy, a direct order from the boss was not something a capo or soldier could quietly override, however uncomfortable it made them. Gotti had already demonstrated, through the murder of Castellano himself, that he was willing to eliminate anyone standing between himself and unquestioned control. By the autumn of 1990, the pieces were in place. Di Bono continued avoiding face-to-face contact with a man who now controlled every lever of his professional and physical survival. The order to kill him had already been given months earlier, discussed openly in a taped conversation, whose existence Di Bono had no way of knowing about. All that remained was opportunity, and Di Bono, still running his construction business, still moving through his daily routine at job sites across the city, was providing that opportunity every single day. The betrayal, when it finally arrived, would not come from a rival family or a jealous partner acting alone. It would come from the ordinary machinery of the organization itself, a soldier assigned the task, a location chosen for its convenience, a family structure so thoroughly built around obedience that no internal alarm was ever raised loudly enough to reach Di Bono before it was too late. In hindsight, everyone around him seemed to sense what was coming. Gravano had been ordered to step back. Capos had heard the boss speak the sentence aloud. Yet the code of silence that had protected the Mafia from outside prosecution for decades worked with equal efficiency on the inside, sealing off any warning that might have reached the one man who needed to hear it. There is a particular cruelty in that structure worth naming directly. Di Bono was killed, not by an enemy who hated him, but by an organization that had simply decided he was no longer worth the trouble of managing. No one hated him enough to warn him. No one loved him enough to intervene. He was, in the family's own cold arithmetic, a liability whose termination had already been approved, filed, and scheduled, waiting only for a convenient afternoon in a familiar parking garage. October 4th, 1990, the parking garage beneath the World Trade Center, the same towers that had made Louis Di Bono's fireproofing contract one of the most lucrative deals of his career. The location was not incidental. Di Bono had business there. It was a place he could be found without suspicion, a place where his presence raised no questions among colleagues or security staff, a place where a man could walk up beside a parked car, fire the shots that ended a life, and walk away again without a single camera recording his face. The killer, according to federal indictments later brought against members of Gotti's crew, was a Gambino soldier named John Carnegie, a man already notorious within law enforcement circles for his role in several of the family's most brutal killings, including disposing of victims' remains in barrels of acid. Carnegie shot Di Bono where he sat, inside his own car, on the lower level of the World Trade Center garage. There was no struggle recorded. No witnesses came forward. No surveillance footage existed to capture what had happened. In a public parking facility beneath one of the most heavily trafficked office complexes in the world, a made member of the Gambino crime family was killed in complete anonymity and remained undiscovered for 3 full days. That detail is not a footnote. It is the entire tragedy compressed into a single image. A man who had spent his career building an identity of quiet invisibility, dying anonymously in the exact way he had lived unnoticed, undisturbed, entirely beneath the surface of the ordinary world moving around him. Commuters parked beside his car. Office workers walked past it on their way to elevators. For 3 days, nobody looked twice. When Gambino underboss Sammy Gravano later testified about the killing, he described his own unease at how long it took for the murder to surface publicly. He had sent a fellow Gambino associate to confirm the killing had actually taken place, troubled that no report of it had appeared in the newspapers or on the evening news. He was told, simply, that the man was dead left in his car in the World Trade Center garage, and that no one yet understood why the story hadn't broken. The answer, when it finally came, was almost absurd in its simplicity. Security at the Twin Towers in 1990 was porous enough that a corpse could sit undisturbed in a public parking garage for 3 days without anyone noticing. It was a gap in basic vigilance that would, less than 3 years later, allow a very different kind of attack to be carried out in that same garage, a truck bomb, driven in without meaningful inspection, detonated in February of 1993. Debano's murder, in that sense, stands as an eerie, isolated warning that went completely unheeded a moment when the vulnerability of that specific parking structure was laid bare, and nothing was done about it. But on the day itself, none of that mattered. What mattered was simpler and colder. A man had ignored the boss's summons one time too many, and the boss had kept his word. Gotti had said months earlier exactly what would happen, and exactly why. On October 4th, 1990, in a fluorescent-lit garage beneath two towers, that promise was fulfilled to the letter. There is a stark contrast worth drawing between the manner of Debano's death and the manner of Castellano's, the killing that had put Gotti on the throne in the first place. Castellano died in a blaze of public violence. 4 gunmen, a crowded Manhattan sidewalk, a getaway captured almost cinematically by chance witnesses and later reconstructed in exhaustive tabloid detail. Debano died in near total silence. A single shooter, an empty garage, a body undiscovered for days. The difference reflects something essential about the two men and what their deaths were meant to communicate. Castellano's murder was a public statement, a seizure of power meant to be seen and understood by an entire underworld watching for signs of a new order. Debano's murder needed no audience. It was not a statement to the city. It was a private settling of accounts, meaningful only to the men inside the family who already understood exactly what a summons ignored had cost him. The murder of Louis Debano did not shake the Gambino family's public image the way the assassination of Paul Castellano had 5 years earlier. There was no restaurant shooting on a crowded Manhattan sidewalk, no tabloid frenzy, no crowd of onlookers. For nearly all of New York, Debano's death barely registered a quiet execution in a quiet corner of the city's busiest office complex, unnoticed until decomposition made it impossible to ignore any longer. Inside the family, however, the killing sent a message with unmistakable clarity. It confirmed, for every capo and soldier watching, exactly what kind of boss now controlled the Gambino organization. One who would order the death of a proven earner, a man who generated real money through real contracts, over the simple offense of failing to appear when called. Under Castellano, that outcome would have been almost unthinkable. Under Gotti, it had become underworld precedent. The business Debano left behind did not go to waste. According to later testimony, Sammy Gudavano Debano's former partner, the man ordered to sever ties with him less than a year before the murder assumed control of the lucrative construction interests Debano had spent his career building. The fireproofing contracts, the union relationships, the entire mechanism of profit Debano had constructed brick by brick, absorbed seamlessly into the machinery of the family that had ordered his death. The killing would eventually resurface in a much larger legal reckoning. Sammy Gravano, after his own arrest in 1990 on unrelated charges, made the decision that would ultimately unravel Gotti's empire. He became a cooperating witness for federal prosecutors, testifying in extraordinary detail about the inner workings of the Gambino family, including the murder of Paul Castellano and the killing of Louis Debano. Gravano's testimony, combined with FBI recordings capturing Gotti discussing Debano's murder in his own words months before it happened, became central evidence in the government's case. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted on charges that included the Debano murder among a string of killings orchestrated during his reign as boss. The man who had escaped conviction so many times that tabloids nicknamed him Teflon was finally sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would die behind bars in 2002. Years later, federal prosecutors would revisit the case again. In 2008, John Carneglia, the soldier alleged to have personally carried out the shooting, was indicted alongside dozens of other Gambino figures in a sweeping racketeering case that dredged up the Debano killing nearly 2 decades after it happened, along with a string of other murders attributed to Gotti's inner circle during the late 1980s and early 1990s. For Debano's family, There was no restitution beyond the slow machinery of federal prosecution finally naming the men responsible. The construction empire he built was gone, absorbed into the very organization that had killed him. His name survived mainly as a footnote, inside much larger legal cases evidence in the prosecution of men more famous than he had ever been. It is worth noting how the underworld itself processed the killing in the months that followed. Wise guys who had come up under Castellano's more permissive rule reportedly discussed De Bono's death with a mixture of caution and disbelief, comparing it unfavorably to the discipline of the previous era. Missing a meeting, however many times, had never before been treated as an offense punishable by death for a soldier who had committed no other violation, no theft from the family, no cooperation with authorities, no disrespect toward a rival crew. That such a mundane failure could now end a man's life told every remaining soldier in the family exactly how much the standard for survival had shifted, and how little space remained for the kind of quiet independence De Bono had spent his career perfecting. And the garage where he died would carry its own grim historical footnote. Less than 3 years after De Bono's body was found in a car that had sat undisturbed for 3 days, a truck bomb detonated in that same underground structure, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000, a preview, in hindsight, of catastrophe still to come for the towers above it. The broader fallout reached far beyond De Bono's individual case. Gravano's decision to cooperate, driven partly by his own legal exposure, and partly by a personal falling out with Gotti over money and blame, dismantled the entire mythology the Teflon Don had built around himself. For years, Gotti had walked out of courtrooms to cheering crowds, convinced that intimidated witnesses and hung juries made him untouchable. Gravano's testimony changed the equation entirely, because it came not from an outsider or a low-level informant, but from the family's own underboss, the second most powerful man in the organization, describing the killings from the inside with the precision of a man who had helped plan them. The 1992 conviction that followed did more than remove Gotti from the streets. It signaled the effective end of the old-style, media-visible mafia boss in New York, the last of a generation of men who had once treated organized crime as a public spectacle rather than a discipline of secrecy. The families that survived Gotti's downfall did so by retreating further into the shadows, precisely the kind of low-profile operation De Bono himself had always preferred, and precisely the kind of operation that had gotten him killed under a boss who demanded the opposite. Return for a moment to that fluorescent-lit garage. A car sitting undisturbed, a man behind the wheel, gone, while the ordinary world walks past him for 3 straight days. There is something almost unbearably precise about the way Louis De Bono lived and the way he died. He built a career on invisibility, on staying out of headlines, avoiding the spotlight, letting his money speak instead of his presence. For years, that invisibility protected him. In the end, it consumed him twice. Once when it made him a target for a boss who demanded visible submission, and again when it left his body unnoticed in a public garage for 3 days, surrounded by people who never thought to look. What does this story actually reveal about organized crime beyond the violence, beyond the tabloid mythology of dapper dons and Teflon reputations? It reveals the fragile, arbitrary nature of power built entirely on personal fear rather than institutional consent. Paul Castellano ran the Gambino family as something resembling a corporation, tolerant of independence so long as revenue flowed upward. John Gotti seized that same family through an act of unsanctioned violence, and to compensate for the legitimacy he lacked, he demanded something Castellano never had to: absolute, visible personal deference from every man beneath him. Under that kind of leadership, loyalty stops being measured by money, by results, by decades of quiet service. It becomes measured by proximity, by whether a man shows up when he is told to, regardless of what he has already built, regardless of what he still has to offer. Debundo had spent his career optimizing for exactly the wrong variable. He built value. He did not build visible submission. And when the rules changed beneath him, that miscalculation cost him his life. There is a public motive and a private motive tangled together in this killing, and the space between them is where the real story lives. Publicly, within the family's own mythology, Debundo died for insubordination, for breaking a rule every soldier was expected to understand. Privately, the killing was about something raw. A boss whose entire claim to power rested on the perception that no one could defy him, enforcing that perception on a man whose independence had simply outlived the era that once permitted it. And so, the story circles back to where it began, to a parking garage beneath towers that no longer stand. To a man who spent 3 unnoticed days as evidence in his own quiet car. To a silence so complete that not even his death could interrupt the routine of the world moving past him. Organized crime, at its core, has never been a story about violence for its own sake. It is a story about hierarchies that demand to be obeyed, and about the men who miscalculate exactly how far that demand extends until the moment they discover, usually too late, that the boss meant precisely what he said. Louis Debundo believed a summons was something that could be delayed. He was wrong only once. It was the only time that mattered. Consider, too, what this case says about the illusion of control inside criminal hierarchies more broadly. Every man who rises inside an organization like the Gambino family believes, at some level, that his usefulness is a form of protection, that money, contracts, and years of quiet service accumulate into something resembling security. Debundo's entire career was built on that belief. He was not a fool. He had watched the family's internal politics for over a decade, understood its rhythms, and built a business empire precisely calibrated to the boss he had always answered to. What he could not account for was the possibility that the entire foundation beneath him would be replaced in a single violent afternoon outside a steakhouse by a man who measured loyalty by an entirely different standard. That is, perhaps, the deepest lesson organized crime has to offer anyone willing to look past its violence. Institutions built on fear, rather than law, are inherently unstable, not because the men who run them are foolish, but because the rules themselves are never fixed. They belong to whoever currently holds the gun, and they can be rewritten the moment that grip changes hands. Soldiers who spent years learning to survive under one boss can find themselves, overnight, operating under a completely different code, one that punishes the very behaviors that once kept them safe. Debundo's death asks a quiet, uncomfortable question of every person who has ever measured their own safety by their usefulness to a system larger than themselves. What happens when the rules change, and no one tells you in time? For Louis Debundo, the answer arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October, in a parking garage he had walked through 100 times before, in a car that would sit undisturbed for 3 more days after the question was finally answered. The towers above him are gone now, too. Nothing from that autumn afternoon in 1990 survived the years that followed, not the man, not the buildings, not the boss who ordered his death from a Brooklyn apartment 9 months earlier. What survives is the pattern. Obedience demanded, distance punished, and a silence so complete that even in death, a man could go unnoticed by the very world he had spent his whole life trying not to disturb.